Okay, good morning, everyone, for this distinguished webinar series in AI and cybersecurity. Today's speaker is Megan Culler, power engineer at Idaho National Lab. The title for today's talk is Cybersecurity for Distributed Energy Resources, All Hazards Approach for Grid Modernization. Megan is a power engineer and researcher in the Infrastructure Security Group at INL. Her work focuses on risk and resilience for power systems, with concentrations on cybersecurity and energy security needed for grid modernization challenges, which includes the increased penetration of renewable energy and inverter-based resources, transmission congestions and queuing delays, and increased digitization. Culler's key contribution to these projects include modeling and simulation, risk analysis, training, development, system design, and red team analysis. She is the principal investigator for a multi-lab distributed wind project and a technical lead for cybersecurity, cyber analytics, and inverter-based resources on numerous other projects. She earned a BS in electrical engineering from Texas A&M with a concentration in power systems and minors in cybersecurity and computer science. She earned a master's in electrical engineering from University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign with dual concentrations in power systems and cybersecurity. Culler's work has been shared through peer-reviewed publications, invited presentations, conference panels, and more. Hey, Megan, thank you so much for joining this webinar. And this is a distinct honor for us to host you as part of this webinar series. And the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you for having me today. I'm excited to be here. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. While I share my screen, I won't be able to see the Zoom window, so if there's burning questions, feel free to interrupt me. Otherwise, I know that we have time for questions at the end.
Yes,
can you see the full screen presentation?
Great. Yeah, we can see you.
Great. All right. So you heard a little bit about my formal background from that bio, but just to give you a little bit more insight into who I am, I'm a power engineer in the Infrastructure Security Group. As you heard, my background is in both power systems and cybersecurity, and it really depends on the project as to which hat I am wearing. So on teams of people with more advanced cybersecurity knowledge, then I tend to bring the power systems focus and the application and discipline understanding to be able to understand how we can apply cybersecurity solutions or what the most impactful cybersecurity events would be for a particular power system application. And similarly, if I'm on systems with really advanced power engineers, then I can kind of bring that cyber flavor to it and talk about why things they may not consider to be risks may actually be risks, and just try to bring that kind of cross-discipline knowledge to these teams. Originally from Albuquerque, New Mexico, went to school in Texas and in Illinois, and now I am working for Idaho National Laboratory, but I live in El Paso, Texas. My husband is stationed here with the Army, and a recent hobby that I have taken up is Schützen dog sports, and so that's a picture of me doing a search and rescue event with my dog. So I was asked to give the talk today about cybersecurity for distributed energy resources. And from looking at some of the other webinars that you guys have had in this series, I think I'm kind of bringing a little bit more power systems background to what you might normally hear about. So I'm going to give a little bit of background on that. So first of all, what is a distributed energy resource, or what is a distributed energy resource? What is DER? And why do we care? What makes these different than traditional power system applications? So traditionally, you had power generated at a large central facility like a natural gas plant. That energy is transmitted over transmission systems to regional areas where that is then distributed to the loads. With DERs, we now have power that is being generated at the ends of those lines, and that can create a variety of different challenges, but also provide more resilience for systems. And so how do we define a DER? I'm going to talk a little bit about terminology here because I think it's important to understand what the differences are when we throw around a lot of these different buzzwords. And this is not necessarily going to be the definitive definition, because what I'll show is that there's many different definitions for what a DER is. but it's typically a small-scale modular generation or storage technology that is operated locally and can be tied to the distribution system. It's not limited to behind-the-meter applications, meaning that it can be something that is owned and operated by a utility. It is not required to be tied to the grid. It could be used in an off-grid application, like a very remote area, or for particular industrial applications like mining that may not otherwise be connected to the grid. It is not limited to inverter-based resources. So inverters are the devices that convert power from DC, the way that it's typically generated with solar and wind, to AC, our 60 hertz power, AC power. It could be a diesel generator. It could be a combined heat and power plant that have these more traditional synchronous generation. It is not limited to supplying energy or to curtailing load. We'll talk about more on that. And it's not particularly defined by a size or a power output. So I think it's just, we typically, when we throw out the word DER, what might come to mind is solar panels and storage. And I think it's just important to recognize it can be larger than that. Here we've got the differences between distributed energy resources and inverter-based resources. Sometimes in certain contexts, these terms are used interchangeably, but I think it's important to recognize what can kind of be separate here. So like I mentioned, diesel generators, although we wouldn't typically think of them as DER because they're not renewables, they can be, and they can act in a similar way. Smart devices, things that actually kind of control the load, building technologies, those can be considered DER, again, even though those are not going to be a generation source. And then on the IBR side, while it does apply to the small DERs, we can also talk about much larger inverter-based resources as well. And then sitting there in the middle are probably more of the traditional things that come to mind, like rooftop solar, distributed wind, battery storage, and EV chargers. So we kind of looked at this slide at the beginning, but again, kind of what I want to highlight here is that with DERs, the assumptions that we have for the traditional and historical grid no longer necessarily hold when we're talking about DERs. So you can kind of think of like the lines getting smaller and smaller as we're going out to these distribution points. And now when we have generation at the end of those lines, that can create challenges with our line capacities, with our transformer capacities, and like where does that energy go, and can we backfeed it back into the grid? And sometimes our infrastructure can support that, sometimes it can't. On top of that, IBRs don't behave, or many DERs, but particularly IBRs, do not behave like traditional generation. I know this is a cybersecurity talk, so I promise to get away from the power engineering soon, but just to give you an example, with traditional generators, when there's a fault in the system, for example, if a line touches the ground, or a line touches another line, or a line touches a tree, the generators, as they're tripping, have a very large fault current contribution. And that allows us, with our protection technologies, to sense that spike in current and to be able to protect the rest of the system by disconnecting it. On the other hand, with inverter-based resources, the fault current contribution is much less, which makes it more difficult to identify when there have been faults, and for our traditional protection technologies to act on that and respond to that. And so really what this means is that we need to understand what assumptions we've kind of baked into our protection, our control, our operation of the grid, and how those might change as we have more and more distributed energy resources. And in particular, this tends to drive more digitization of the system. We've got all of these distributed resources that are out in various physically separated areas, maybe a bunch of rooftop solar panels that are located in a neighborhood, or maybe a distributed wind farm that's located 3 miles away. So what we end up needing is more digitization to be able to communicate with those technologies, either to send controls or also to collect more real-time information from these systems. So rather than sensing locally and acting locally, as we may have been able to do in the past, we're pushing towards this paradigm of being able to sense everywhere and also then just be able to act locally. And what this requires is more communications. Another key challenge with DER is that there's a lot of different stakeholders involved. Whereas previously you may have had less than a dozen manufacturers of large turbines or large generators, we now have hundreds, if not thousands, of DER vendors. And so in the past, these 4 or 5 or 6 different vendors could convene at IEEE meetings and talk about the equations that governed their technologies and write standards that were based on that. Now, with all of these different manufacturers and vendors and aggregators and developers, you've got a lot more people that are in that market and a lot more proprietary technology around exactly how these inverters or technologies are working. And again, that kind of adds some obscurity to exactly how the devices are behaving, which means that if we don't know how they're behaving, we need to be able to sense that and act on their behaviors. It also creates some different modeling challenges that they're not behaving in the field the way that we expect them to, which is causing some interesting conditions and unexpected conditions sometimes. So just wanted to point out that this ecosystem and the number of people who want access to data for different reasons, for different business operations, is complex. So we saw all the stakeholders. Here's kind of how they might look in more of a DER architecture sense. So we've got our actual DERs down here at the bottom. Then we have kind of our facility level here. Our third level is aggregators and flexibility agents. In this fourth layer, then we may have the distribution utility who's doing grid management and either needs to know how these devices are behaving or at the very least needs to know how these devices are behaving and may even have the ability to send controls back down. We can even talk about how they interact with the transmission market, which is the larger, higher voltage areas. Obviously, these will have a connection to the distribution utilities, but in some cases, they may even be talking directly to some of these plant level controls as well. And then on top of all of that, we have these market drivers that are driving the business decisions for how all of these independent stakeholders are operating. So as we're putting all of these pieces together, we've got this very complex ecosystem of stakeholders. We've got different behaviors that are changing the way that the grid operates. And on top of that, we're driving change very quickly. According to the 2021 data and the 2030 goals, we're going to need a lot more wind and solar to get to those carbon-free targets and net zero targets. These are the federal targets, but there's also state level targets and even organizational targets for achieving net zero that is driving the installation of a lot of different, again, I'm highlighting PV and wind, but a lot of different DER. Now, some of this capacity is going to come in the form of bulk IBRs, like we were talking about earlier, and the difference between those bulk systems and the distributed systems. But regardless of how this works, we're going to be adding a lot more facilities, a lot more endpoints. And so to put all of these pieces together, as we're talking about the growth of DER and what that means for the grid, we can translate some of these into an impact to cybersecurity and things that we need to address on the cybersecurity and digitization front. So we've got more stakeholders, more endpoints. That's going to result in a larger attack surface and potentially more vulnerabilities, especially as we're developing fast. And there's an argument, or there's a business driver to be first to market rather than secure to market. We've got electrification in loads, more heating that's going electric, more cooking gas, traditionally things that were gas that is going electric, obviously EVs. And so we've got growth in load. That means there's potentially a larger impact if something does happen to our power systems. We're aggregating the DER so that they're all managed by larger central points rather than being individually managed as distributed assets. We're seeing increased regulation, although obviously regulation tends to lag behind technology. And then we also talked about the digitization of monitoring, control, and sensing, and the distribution of control among all of these different stakeholders. So there's plenty of challenges to address in the cybersecurity for DER space. And in fact, this is something that NERC, the National Electric Reliability Corporation, has put into their, or has recognized in their risk and reliability priorities report. This one's a couple of years old, but you can see that some of their top concerns are the changing resource mix and cybersecurity vulnerabilities. So when we put all of these pieces together, kind of talked about this already, but just to kind of demonstrate how all of these things are playing together, we've got aging power infrastructure that is traditionally based in greenhouse gas emissions, which is contributing to climate change, which is driving the growth of renewables and carbon-free targets. We've also got increased electrification in order to reduce those greenhouse gases. That increased electrification and growing load is stressing our aging infrastructure. And that aging infrastructure also creates an opportunity for the growth of renewables, but we're being slowed by transmission queues, which is also caused by our aging infrastructure. The increased electrification, the growing load is increasing the stress on our transmission systems as well, and driving more delays in that as we stack up things in that queue. We've got physical attacks on infrastructure, and we've also got rising cyber attacks that are targeting both our aging infrastructure and interested in the increased digitization and the opportunities that are presented by the growth of renewables. And so really just what I want to demonstrate here is that there's a lot of interconnected challenges. And as somebody who sits in a national laboratory and is looking at a lot of different grid modernization challenges, I think the interesting thing here is that some of these are contributing to each other. So for example, we want to have more renewables, but we see how that also creates a larger cybersecurity attack surface. And so how do we address all of these together, and how do we prioritize which ones we need to address first? We don't want to slow down the growth of renewables by dragging it in regulation and cybersecurity reviews, but at the same time, we need to have that baked in from the beginning in our design phases, rather than trying to put that in after the fact in 20 or 30 years when we're suffering from a bunch of cyber attacks. So where do we start? I've put this kind of target level together, not to say that one of these areas is more important than another, but just to say here's one way to frame how we address the cybersecurity challenges in this ecosystem. And I've also highlighted here some of the different cybersecurity areas, and some of these are even just digitization areas that need to be addressed. So we can talk about the device level, which we can talk about software bill of materials, hardware bill of materials, firmware analysis, vendor responsibilities, how vendors access their devices. We can talk about the plant or the aggregator level, having secure architecture designs, having distributed energy resource management systems, or DERMS, and how those can be secured from a controls perspective. We can talk about the utility. The utility obviously has a lot of other concerns beyond just the DERs that may be on their system, like grid services, maintaining the reliability of the grid through voltage and frequency control, managing third-party access to all the assets that may be on their system. In fact, in some cases, the utility may be considered the third party because they are not the owners or the operators of these DER devices. And then we can also kind of talk about the overall ecosystem, which includes regulation. And this is not limited to just regulation from a federal entity, but also state entities. And then we can also talk about other drivers for cybersecurity regulation, like cyber insurance policies that may help incentivize adoption of cybersecurity practices. So I'm going to kind of walk through these different areas and highlight some of the different lab projects that I'm a part of and how they contribute to these different areas. This is just going to be a selection of the types of projects that we work on, but I think it can be hopefully interesting to you to think about all of the different types of research that there is in this space, which on face level seems to be a fairly niche space. So starting from the device level, if we're talking about DERs, why do different technologies require different cybersecurity considerations? And in some sense, they don't. In some sense, a lot of what we need in this space is just application of existing best practices or existing cybersecurity practices and technologies. But at the same time, I think it's important to consider what is the actual device that you're protecting and how might your priorities change. So when we're talking about solar, we've got a whole lot of vendors with different ranges of maturity, and it's a very diverse stakeholder ecosystem, which means that there's not really much standardization across that space, which can make it challenging both from a device level and from levels above that for how to manage these assets and how to communicate with them. We see some vendors that are adopting secure protocols and others that are sticking with Modbus. And so how do you integrate all of that into a secure ecosystem? With wind, and specifically distributed wind, we see a small number of large vendors, so the Vestas, the GEs, that have a higher level of vendor maturity. And then there's also still a lot of smaller vendors that sell smaller turbines that may not have the resources or the team behind them or the diversity of different applications that drive cybersecurity maturity across the business. The other unique consideration with wind is that there's a lot of physically moving parts, and so that can affect the type of impacts that we consider from a cybersecurity perspective. Can you change the blade angles, adjust them the way that they're meant to be adjusted to turn in and out of wind and cause a blade strike hitting the turbine tower? And then there's an increased ability to physically access these turbines. If you've ever driven past a wind farm, I don't know if anyone's ever tried to drive up to them, but often you can drive up right to the base of that turbine. Maybe you have to go through a farmer's gate to get there. Typically, they're secured at the base of the tower with a physical lock. It's fairly easy to cut that lock if you're somebody who's motivated to do so. And now all of a sudden you're in the turbine and you may have access to controls if they're housed in that facility. With storage, we can talk about the increased impact and the impact of this bidirectional power flow of being able to charge and discharge and the controls that are associated with that. As an adversary, if I were to get access to that system, there's a new range of potential adversarial actions I could take to misuse that storage asset. From an EV perspective, we can talk about personal data and privacy considerations. You know, what happens when I go and plug my car into a charger? What does it need to know about me? How does those payment methods work? And as well as, you know, what is the actual physical impact to the grid? And similarly with building load technologies and load control technologies, to consider how these devices are connected across different sectors and the impact directly to humans because of that. So as you're working on technologies and potentially working on proposals that may look at power systems, think about what the technology is and what the unique considerations would be. At INL, we have a pretty robust program in supply chain security, both on the software supply chain and hardware supply chain. So here's an example of, or as an example, we have torn apart a few different solar inverters and done the hardware catalogs, the hardware bill of materials enumeration, so that you can start to track what are the components across these different devices, what are the similarities in components across different devices and across different vendors, so that if it becomes known that one chip has a particular vulnerability, I can know that it's not just affecting that vendor, but maybe a range of different vendors if they're using similar types of technologies on their boards. Another example here is automated firmware analysis. So we've used some machine learning techniques to pull firmware apart and to draw these common weakness and attack pattern graphs. This is using a technology called, or a system called STIG, which is Structured Threat Intelligence Graphs. And this provides a nice visual way to look at what are the weaknesses and what are the common attack patterns that may be used to exploit those weaknesses. And this example here is for some solar inverter technology. So moving on from the device level to the plant or the aggregator level, typically here we're thinking of something that's focused on one technology type, although that's not going to be exclusively true as we talk about hybrid plants, wind storage, solar storage, solar wind, and these entities may be responsible for the production and for the management of these combined assets and how they connect to the utility. So I wanted to highlight one application here, which is a small microgrid application. And while this is not necessarily, this is a research test bed, but it kind of, the types of research that we are doing on this test bed represent kind of the level that an aggregator or a plant level controller might see. So this research takes place in Plum Island, New York. We have a microgrid test bed that we have set up there, and it's meant to represent something that could be distributed across a few different facilities. So we've got 3 different segments, A, B, and C. We've got 2 different battery energy storage systems and 1 solar array. And this project that ended a year or so ago was specifically looking at how to add renewable storage and sensors to the existing microgrid and how to manage those assets. And then we also did some resilience and cyber testing of these assets. And so one of the projects that I had was pretty much to poke at the battery as best as I could, but we needed the battery to remain operational. So I was a little bit limited in, as in I couldn't go tear apart the device itself. And so I kind of had this more aggregator level view or this plant control level view of what interactions do I have through the API with the device and how could an adversary potentially misuse those. As an example, one of the things that I could manipulate was the voltage support set points. So here in this, let me think about this for a second. All right, so the regions are not necessarily put in logical order. So I'm going to start from the back here. Region 5 is when these voltage support controls are turned off. And what we can see is with these darker lines here, the nominal voltage is right here around 280. And our nominal voltage, or our voltage that we were measuring, is a little bit low. So when you have the correct voltage controls turned on, we see something like region 1 and region 4, where we're injecting reactive power, this orange line, and we're driving our voltage up towards that nominal voltage. However, there were not any limits enforced on the parameters that set those voltage controls. And so I was able to invert those support functions entirely. And instead of injecting reactive power when the voltage was low, I could absorb reactive power when the voltage was low and actually drive this voltage even lower. Now, our system was tolerant enough of that, but in some systems, and if you were able to drive that low enough, either the battery itself or other devices around it would start tripping off. And potentially, if you could do this in a coordinated manner, you might be able to trip off many devices at once and cause some actual power system instability issues. And so there were some other API manipulation type attacks that we worked around as well. Some set points that were not, some set points that could just be modified adversarially depending on the application, like what you would expect for it versus what you actually did with it. Excuse me. Some interesting use of timeout functions could go directly to the battery mode. And then we also looked at how to combine the effects of this. So we looked at a few different ways to try to synchronize our attacks on both batteries in order to kind of see if we could hit the system harder in a synchronized manner. And not just the individual effects from each battery, but kind of even bringing it above that by doing it exactly at the same time. We were not quite as successful with that last part as we thought we would be able to be. Another approach we took here was more of a manual fuzzing technique. Did not get to the automated fuzzing, but just looking at the security measures that were on here, which included some different tokens and certificates for the communications, and finding that maybe those weren't quite implemented correctly, because sometimes we were able to read and write in ways that we didn't expect to be able to. Working with invalid parameter names and invalid parameter limits. Some limits were enforced as they were documented. Some were enforced to a different set point than what they were documented as, and some didn't seem to be enforced at all, which was interesting. And then the last piece here was looking more at just the overall device and the network and the interface monitoring. So just kind of doing some of these like very basic cyber techniques, finding that some ports were open that we didn't expect to, finding some interfaces, some web interfaces that we didn't know existed. Didn't find anything like terribly exciting here, but just kind of going through this process that would be a basic reconnaissance activity for an adversary, and finding some things that we didn't expect to. Then the other piece of this project that I mentioned at the beginning is looking at kind of, again, that plant level controls. And so we developed in partnership with another laboratory a distributed autonomy control algorithm that decided when and how to bring the solar inverters online based on when it was safe to do so and when they could add support to the system as the system was starting up from a black start, as well as if the system collapsed, to be able to automatically bring them back up as it was safe to do so. This looks at so if you get a command, whether that's an adversarial command or an operator command for these devices to come online and connect, verification devices are sitting in front of each one of these inverters to collaboratively assess whether it is safe for all of these devices to do so, and then decide in which order it's safe for them to do that. And you don't need to know all of the details of the slide other than to say that it was successful. And so what we're looking at is how to move again from those traditional methods of control towards new methods of cyber resilient control that take into account the distributed nature of some of these resources. All right, we're jumping up our target to the utility level now. There are many different types of utilities in the United States. This is just a quick graph to kind of show the number of utilities versus the number of customers that they serve. What's interesting to see here, I guess, is that these large investor-owned utilities serve the most customers, but there's the fewest number of them because they are large entities. We've got cooperatives, which are member-owned utilities. There's about 900 of those across the United States. And then we have publicly owned utilities, which include state-owned or municipal utilities that also serve a portion of the population. And so utilities are responsible for the generation and distribution of power. They may or may not have generation assets, depending on what type of utility they are. They are the ones that kind of, this is where the, whether or not it should, at least today, this is kind of where the buck stops, right? So they're the ones that are responsible for providing reliable power, and they're the ones that are going to get blamed if something happens, regardless of whether or not that's something that they actually have under their control. There's a range of maturity among these different types of utilities. So cooperatives and municipal utilities are typically going to be very small. I won't say that they're understaffed, but they're not necessarily going to have the staff or the budget to hire a dedicated cyber person, let alone a cyber team. And then we can compare that to the investor-owned utilities. And there's some very robust investor-owned utilities out there that have very mature cybersecurity programs. So when we talk about utilities and talk about the power sector, sometimes there's a perception of, they're stuck in the past. They don't know what they're talking about. Why are they still using these legacy devices? They don't have mature cybersecurity programs. And I think some of those assumptions can be true in some places, but I also don't think that it's true across the board. And I think across any of these types of utilities, you're going to see that they are aware of cybersecurity considerations and they're aware of that threat, but they're only going to be able to act on it to the extent that it poses a risk that they can feasibly address to their system. So as cybersecurity researchers, what we need to do is to be able to accurately quantify what that risk is to their system, considering both the size and the impact of that system, understanding that some systems are small and they're not going to be very big targets for an adversary, but at the same time, if they're small and they're very easy, low-hanging fruit, they could still be affected. And then, of course, tying this back into our DER conversation, some of these utilities will own DERs directly. Some of them will have members that own these devices, and some of them may just receive that power from entities that are kind of a step above them. So on the utility scale, we have a variety of projects that kind of address the needs of these types of stakeholders. One that we've been working on for a few years is our Cyber Shield program. The SHIELD acronym stands for Security Through Hardware Integration, Education, and Layered Defense. And in particular, we're using a couple of tools that were developed for other OT applications and customizing them to the renewable space. So we don't need to reinvent the wheel entirely for this space, but we also do need to consider the unique needs of the stakeholders, what types of maturity and capabilities they currently have, and what types of assets they're providing, so that we're not just throwing cybersecurity solutions at them that don't really make sense. And so I've listed the three kind of key components here. We use a tool called Malcolm, which can be used as sort of an IDS, but here we're using it more to link business processes to OT devices and communications, and sort of do that setting the floor of what is actually on your system and what do we need to prioritize for defense on that system. And then we're also using CyberSearch. Search is the cybersecurity evaluation, let me think, cybersecurity evaluation and risk tool. I might have that acronym wrong. And this is one that allows, it's more of a questionnaire type self-assessment of does your programs, do your policies, does your system line up against standards that are applicable to your industry, and also best practices that may be in that industry. So again, that's something that needs to be customized to the particular spaces that renewables are operating in. And then the last level I'm going to talk about is regulation. It's kind of a broad category, and when I'm talking about that, I am talking about federal and state regulation. I'm also going to throw standards, insurance, and best practices kind of into this discussion. Again, all of these can be drivers for improving cybersecurity maturity, but they're going to have different tools to incentivize cybersecurity among these different types. So if you're not familiar, there are 3 interconnections in the United States: the Western, the Eastern, and Texas. And I actually live in this little tiny corner of Texas here under New Mexico that is not connected to the ERCOT interconnection. So I actually live in the WEC, in the Western Electric Connection. But federal regulations typically apply to these larger interconnections, and they don't apply to ERCOT because there's no interstate transmission of energy, which means that the federal authorities don't have regulatory authority over what's going on here. So if you hear things about Texas being a little bit different, that's often why. Texas has more of a market-driven approach. And that's a discussion for another day, or for the questions if you want to ask me more about that. So in addition to the federal regulations that we also have state regulations that are set by public utility commissions. So there's one of these in each state. Some of them are elected, some of them are appointed by governors. but these are the people who are actually setting the rules that must be adhered to by utilities within that state. And so what that means is that when we talk about things like standards, IEEE, IEC, even now for renewable spaces, we're seeing more things come out of Underwriters Laboratory, SunSpec, and SEIA, the Solar Energy Industries Association. But those don't have any weight unless a state regulator or a federal regulator adopts those. Now, some organizations may choose to adopt these standards for their own organizations, but they don't really have any drivers behind them unless they are adopted by actual regulators. Insurance is this interesting place where if you want to have the cyber insurance, then the insurance providers can actually have a pretty big say in what types of cyber policies you need to be enforcing in order for them to grant you that insurance. Cyber insurance and cyber insurance for utilities is still a growing area. And what we expect is that there will be a lot that plays out in the courts as incidents occur and lawyers try to interpret whether or not you have met the requirements of different policies. Hopefully this will also drive more specific details as to what is in some of these policies and what is required for good programs. Then of course we also have best practices, which are available from a variety of different sources for a variety of different applications, but they are non-binding, and if they are enforced, they have to be enforced at an organizational level. So in the laboratory space, this is something where we get an opportunity to work a little bit as well. One of my newest projects is a grid modernization initiative project called the Assessment of DER Cybersecurity Standards. This is a brand new project, so I don't have anything to show on the slide yet, other than a lot of words on what we intend to do. But really what we're trying to do here is collect all of the different DER cybersecurity standards, as well as communication standards, safety standards, interconnection standards, things that may have a cyber component, put those in a database that makes it accessible and easy to search for to see what applies to a particular user. And then also continue to work within some of these industry standards to help drive alignment of these standards across different bodies, and to drive adoption of best practices into standards. Also to make sure that we're not developing new standards that don't need to be there, right? We don't need to invent a new standard for every single technology or every single application. Let's figure out how to take the existing standards and add to them or modify them as necessary so that they do apply across the DER space. And then the last piece that I want to talk about, and I'm running just a couple more minutes here, is how do we actually put some of this into practice? It's great for universities and great for national laboratories to do the research, to publish reports, to publish best practice guides, to do laboratory experiments, but how do we actually get this out into industry? And how do we get it into industry fast enough that we can continue to, or that we can add security into that growth that we talked about at the beginning, as we're pushing towards these high deployments in the next 20 to 30 years. So what we do, we seek out case study partners. We work with industry as much as possible. We offer technical assistance programs where industry can come to us and ask for help on specific problems that we may have expertise in. We work on training and workforce development programs. We help DOE run tabletop exercises as well as full-scale exercises. And we participate in industry and government groups and advisory boards to use our unique space in between research and application to try to help bridge that gap and apply our domain knowledge. So one of these training programs that I've worked on is called CyberStrike Storm Cloud. The original CyberStrike program was developed to educate people about the 2015 and 2016 Ukraine attacks. And within the last 2 years, we've now developed a renewable version of this training that focuses on incidents that have actually happened in the renewable sector. And it provides hands-on exercises for students to actually walk through what some of these vulnerabilities and exploits look like. So we have this training box here that's got a single access solar tracker, a mock wind turbine that's got a couple of fans blowing on it, an HMI, and then we don't have it yet, but there's space for an EV charger on this platform as well. And so we're actually executing attacks, or students are actually executing attacks and seeing what happens when they type something in on their laptop that's got the remote communication. And so, for example, with this solar tracker, typically when you hold up a cell phone light to it, it'll track that light back and forth like a solar panel would do for the sun. And we have an attack that we walk our students through where they push a malicious firmware update to the controller for that solar panel. And then when you hold the light up to it, it actually tracks away from the light source rather than towards it. So if something like that were to happen in practice, all of a sudden your solar production would go way down. Another one that I wanted to highlight, and then I will wrap up, is Liberty Eclipse. This is one of our full-scale cybersecurity exercises. This is also done on Plum Island microgrid that I mentioned earlier. And here we bring out utilities, both their security operations teams and their power operations teams, to work together and work with each other, like different organizations working together to kind of get some of that cross-learning. And then we have our laboratory red team that runs attacks on that microgrid, and then these teams have to respond to them to get that actual hands-on incident response practice. And it's interesting to see these operations teams, when we run an attack and all of a sudden, the generator is down or their loads have been disconnected and they're running around trying to figure out what exactly happened, going through their responses that they would go through in practice, as well as learning how to work with their security teams a little bit better to understand what happened from the security side. All right, that was my most of my presentation. I've got a slide here. I'm sure we can share this later. Talks about if you want to kind of learn more about these programs or work with the laboratory, what the processes for that look like, either to work with us on specific projects through FOAs or lab calls, or also to come intern with us as an intern or a fellow. So with that, I will stop sharing and be happy to take any questions with the remainder of our time.
Thank you, Megan. That's fantastic presentation. Thank you so much for the time. And audience can start asking their questions now, and we'll read out your questions. Okay, while we wait for some questions, I think there's one question here. Okay. Are there any open source DER data available?
I guess my question back would be, are you talking about production data or like controls and network data? Certainly from the production side, maybe my answer to both would be that there's lots of simulated data and hardware in the loop simulated data that's available. It is harder to get access to the real data. And typically, even if we do, it is often protected by non-disclosure agreements. So if you can find a industry group that's willing to work with you, whether that's a utility or a vendor, those are good ways to get access to real data.
Great. I have another question. Thank you for the presentation. Could you please brief if any standards are followed in creating the test beds? Also, could you please point out the general tools that are used for simulation malicious attacks on power systems, specifically in BESS?
Yeah. So with the microgrid testbed design, it can be grid connected. So we certainly have to follow electrical standards of safety when we're developing that testbed. We'll say that for that particular testbed, we've got a little bit more free range than what you're going to typically find with a utility. But I guess I would say that we're following more of the traditional power standards. We do use real data collectors like the, trying to think of the right word, are the historians, the HMIs, the RTUs, all of those are real power equipment. So The standards that are baked into that in terms of cyber communications are all followed. So we do operate it to the best of our ability like a real system would be. And then tools that are used for simulation of attacks on power systems. Some of our attacks are custom developed code. Some of our attacks are based on known vulnerabilities and proof of concept code that has been published. In terms of tools, in our cyberstrike training, we show how some typical reconnaissance and exploit tools can be used, like Shodan, to look at what the exposures are. We show things like X-Hydra and password cracking. We use tools like Nmap, Wireshark, Ettercap to look at some of that network reconnaissance activities and even network exploits to see how, to custom craft packets and that sort of thing. All of that would be applicable to BESS. In terms of like our testbed and attacks on real devices, trying to think if there's any like widespread tools.
There are so many
And
open.
I really think that it's more custom developed. I don't know if there's anything that is specifically targeted towards battery systems right now.
Thank you. And so what is your opinion about digital twin for cybersecurity management? Should there be any regulation to force companies for employing digital twin, or what do you think about this?
I have seen some robust digital twin projects that have built very accurate digital twin representations of systems. Maybe I'll step back and see. I've seen digital twins used in a few different ways. I think they're a good tool. I don't know that I currently see any push towards using those as a required piece in regulation. Certainly, there's a challenge in the distributed energy space to develop digital twins that accurately model each individual type. We talked about the wide variety of vendors. Do you think digital twins could be a valuable tool, and machine learning in general can be a valuable tool to solve some of our current modeling challenges? So where we currently use equations that don't quite mimic the real world behavior of some of these devices correctly, and that causes issues in our models. It could be that digital twins or machine learning can help solve some of that modeling gap so that we have more accurate representations of the system. And then as a cybersecurity tool, like I said, I've seen some robust uses of that to detect cyber intrusions and anomalous behavior. And I think the biggest barrier to adoption is just going to be to have accurate digital twins of like all the potential devices, and to be able to accurately detect anomalies in all of those different scenarios. So I don't know that I see it being required as an adoption piece because of the amount of effort that it would require.
Great. You've been talking to vendors, and what are you hearing from vendors in terms of there are so many types of communication protocols out there, Modbus, 2030.5, and what is your perspective or experience in the attack surface, or which one is more vulnerable? What is your insight on these protocols, and how do you see going forward? SunSpec is another one, and I think I'm just trying to get your perspective on what is your experience on as we move forward on more DER integration.
On the vendor side, I think I'm seeing more offerings of solutions with secure protocols, or at least something besides Modbus or DNP3. And seeing more of that baked in, which I think is good. However, I'm still seeing a lot of that being retained, or some of the insecure and historically used protocols being retained as options. So for example, with that battery system that I mentioned in my presentation, it has a REST interface, which uses certificates and tokens to provide authentication for each session. That's fairly robust. And what we found is that we weren't able to do man-in-the-middle attacks because of that. as well as some IP whitelisting that the device did. However, it also has a Modbus interface, and there was no way to turn off that Modbus interface. And so I could use the REST interface as much as I wanted, but I could also just send a Modbus command from anywhere on the network, from any device, unauthenticated, and it would accept it and implement it as well. So there's still some after the fact or tacked on, like, architecture design pieces that we would have to implement to make that secure. So I could use the REST interface for my approved communications, and then implement a firewall rule to drop all Modbus traffic and put that switch right in front of, or put that router right in front of the device, and maybe I would be secure. So I think there's more secure offerings being offered, but they're still retaining some of those insecure offerings. And so we may still need to do some work to make sure that there's not some unexpected backdoors.
We have another question. There are a lot of extreme weather events are happening, and how do you see, we have a lot of students who are listening to this webinar, and what are your, open-ended research problems specifically comes to DER, in relation to extreme weather events, whether it's on wind or solar farms or, or BESS, or electric vehicles, and how do you see there is a need for more research on extreme weather events, or our INL or you or your team is actually looking at any aspects of on case studies with reference to extreme weather events, whether it's floods, high winds, or tornadoes, or whatever.
Mm-hmm. So I see a lot of my projects being tied together by kind of a common theme of risk, and I focused on the cyber risk projects and challenges in this presentation. But the other part of that risk is kind of the physical risk, whether that's physical attacks or natural events. So certainly DERs can provide resilience to extreme weather events because they're local resources, because they provide a diversity of resources. So whereas traditionally, maybe after a hurricane or after a tornado, you'd be relying on diesel backups. If you're looking at extended outages, you need to be considering your fuel supply and your diesel fuel supply, your diesel fuel reserves. Those diesel generators are often maybe run once a year. And so sometimes they don't work in the case of an emergency because they haven't been maintained and operated very much. So those are areas where DERs or renewable DERs can make a difference and provide resilience to local communities. Certainly, we also have to consider how those devices themselves are resilient to the weather events. Your wind turbines are going to protect themselves during a hurricane and stop spinning. They're going to lock up. But they might be able to come back faster than the power repairs would following. The tornado comes through in 30 minutes, but it could take hours for the power to be restored by line crews, whereas my wind could start spinning pretty quickly after that. So overall, yes, there's certainly research in that area. I don't know that INL is necessarily doing a ton of the climate modeling work, but there are other labs that are doing that climate modeling work to better predict the likelihood of some of those extreme weather events and to analyze what is the traditional or what is the expected impact on power system infrastructure from those types of events.
In the interest of time, I think we'll take the last question and then we'll wrap this up. And I think the last question is, how do you see, efforts on hardening substation cybersecurity aspect? Are you working on anything in this domain to harden the substation's physical or cyber aspect of it?
Yeah, I think one of the first times I talked to someone about what I did, at an industry event, I remember talking about security. I do security for power grids. And they said, or I do cybersecurity for power grids. I said, oh yeah, that's so important. We're putting up so many cameras at our substations. And I was like, that's not cybersecurity. That's physical security. Like, I get it. Your camera's a digital recording of that. Where I'm going with that is just that, yes, there's lots of work on physical security as well. INL has one project in particular on improving the physical security of transformers. We've seen that transformers have been big targets for people who want to go and shoot up the substation. Because those are expensive products, they have long lead times. You don't typically have a lot of those in reserve. So they are trying to cause an impact. Frankly, it makes sense why those are targets. So we are working on hardening that sort of thing. Certainly cyber and physical monitoring of those stations. How do we increase the physical security of DERs? That's kind of a new challenge, right? Because not all of those DERs are going to be behind a locked substation fence. Now we can make arguments about whether that locked substation fence is a good enough protection for the substation. But when I can walk over to my neighbor's house and unplug their solar panels from their meters, there's no barriers to that. So I guess I'll talk about it from one perspective, which is wind. I mentioned the physical security issues there. There are things that we can do both on the physical side and on the security side. Put better locks on the doors, not something that can just be cut, but maybe something that requires like the keypad password as well. Certainly using two-factor authentication, using different passwords at each of my different sites so that if I learn the password to one, I don't learn it to all of it. Certainly switching it from the default so that if I walk up to a device, I can't just use the vendor default password to log into it, and having more stringent like remote device policies, so that if a USB is plugged in, whatever is on that is not run by default and requires extra authentication in order to run whatever's on that USB drive. Those are some of the measures I think that we can take to protect the cyber and digital infrastructure given the physical security limitations of DER.
Thank you, Megan. I think fantastic. Thank you so much for spending your time this morning with us. And I think it's been a great asset for adding your recording for the webinar series. And as part of this contribution, you will receive a nice plaque from UND and our dean, and as a token of appreciation for your time. Thank you so much. We'll also share the recording with you, so you have a chance to promote in a way that you think is appropriate. And thank you so much.
Yep. Thank you all for your time. Thanks for attending. It was a pleasure to talk to you, and feel free to reach out if you've got any other follow-up questions or want to talk about any of these projects.
Thank you.